Hello, hello. Hello, hello. Can I have your attention? If we could reconvene here. We'd like to get into our wrap-up session. While we're waiting for everybody to get seated, I do want to remind you of our Farm to Fly No Host Dinner. There's a one-page pickup on the table under that whiteboard to the back of the room there on the way out. The No Host Dinner is at Cobb's Landing, 200 North Indian River Drive, Fort Pierce. I think we went there in our January meeting, and there's a phone number, and it is currently 3:15. We hope to reconvene there at 5:30 tonight. Any problems getting to the restaurant, you can call me. My cell number is on the paper, but as you go out, you could pick up, there are not directions, but this North Indian River Drive is about 5 miles to the east. If you just, you put in the 200 North Indian Drive in your Google, that's probably the safest thing. So if anybody has any questions, give me a call. With that, I thought we could ask Rich to tell us where his group, what were the action, what challenges, the key challenges and the actions and any changes he might have. Rich?
Works. Good. So we discussed on the agenda sheet items 2, policy and regulatory barriers, and then also the sustainability and NGO evaluation. Fundamentally, the 5 items that we put down in the approaches in broad terms were accepted by our working group as being pertinent. We did get into some additional coaching and helping on strategies of those, but the one thing I wanted to do, and I wanted to invite Dave Meyer up here, we did come up with an additional element that affects the economics of the regulatory policy, and Dave will grab a seat here and explain it to you what the thought is, and we want to add that then to the list as important.
All right, thanks. I wasn't expecting to be front and center. But yeah, so one of the discussion points that we had was just making sure that the regulatory framework that we have that provides different incentives for the production of different kinds of fuel essentially adequately recognizes the value of sustainable jet fuel. And a couple of key points there. One is that the low carbon fuel standard in California currently does not recognize jet fuel as at least under that regulatory system. There is an effort to get jet fuel included under the standard, but currently it is not. So that presents a challenge in that there's significant additional value that can be recognized for ethanol under that standard as opposed to when it's converted into jet fuel. And then there's also just a little bit of a challenge even under the renewable fuel standard because of the fact that you're essentially converting 2 gallons of ethanol into 1 gallon of jet fuel. There is some loss of value there from a RIN perspective that needs to be addressed. So it's just making sure that the regulatory incentives are aligned to incentivize the production of jet fuel, which is something that we all know, as was mentioned earlier. Jets aren't going to stop flying on liquid fuels anytime soon, and we need to make sure that the liquid fuels that are produced are properly recognized for their contributions.
Yeah, we need to phrase that in what's pertinent to the Florida situation, and I was discussing this with Ed Fielding here a little bit. You want to be in a situation, growers will be happy if their ethanol is bought and sold somewhere other than the state of Florida. So for example, if you ship ethanol off to California, you get a better deal. in terms of the benefits, in terms of producing ed products under the California Air Force Air Resources Board regulations. The problem with that is that you suboptimize the total benefit for the state of Florida. So Florida airports don't benefit from fuel going into their situation, which we could produce with alcohols shipped off to Sopperton, Georgia, potentially, and converted to jet fuel there and then shipped back to the airports where they would be produced here. So the thing that we need to look at from a state perspective is the policies that would allow you to incentivize keeping your fuel in Florida. There's been a lot of criticism of things like wood pellets for similar reasons. Yeah, we grow them and then we don't get any benefit from them. They end up going to Europe. So I think that's a discussion that we need to have at the state level. And we brought this up with Mike as well. So we need to add a challenge relative to the incentives to keep fuel instant and also get maximum benefit. In general, it works okay with jet. But in the case of ATJ, where you would need 2 gallons of ethanol to make 1 gallon of jet fuel, that math doesn't work for you necessarily. Most of the rest of what we discussed were mostly tactics on the front end. And I think I was going to do this, but I think it's worth mentioning a couple of them. Mike Adams, who was with us, mentioned we rue the lack of the engagement of the local NGOs in the process. So the thought process was that we're maybe attacking this the wrong way, that trying to get the local groups to come out to fight the next development is maybe the wrong approach. That what you want is, and he mentioned 2 groups, Harbor Branch and ORCA, which is not the whale. It's the Ocean Research Conservation Association. So potentially, say you go with surrogates and try to get them involved in the next meeting, which I guess Harbor Branch was involved originally, or the local folks are. So you get the people who are respected for their work by the local folks. The local folks, if presuming that they don't engage, they would accept analysis or approaches from them. So that really goes with the securing stakeholders question. And Mike had given that some thought, and I think we ought to pursue that. The other things were actually strategies and tactics for our other work. And on the procurement effort, and we discussed the work that Tom's done and the whole BEAT certification piece at the ground level and at the crop level. But the point that you made, Dave, was that the fuel that eventually comes from that is, there really are 2 pieces. Ultimately, certification would have to cover both processing and the side of making the fuel. And that particular issue, it would appear that ethanol being ethanol, you could pursue that part under RSB, which they seem to accept, with whom the airlines would accept that outcome. I think EPA would. So if you get your part done on with the crops themselves, coupling that with an RSB activity, which could be acceptable to the Sharon Lees of the world, and we should test that at our meeting, assuming Sharon will be there, and I think she might very well be there at this meeting. So that becomes a meeting that we want to have. The other discussion we had was, how do you attract BETO? The DOE people who have not engaged so far because sugar is a crop that they don't want to deal with under the Title I provision. So we got an elaboration on the discussion we had this morning with the Toronto family here. And the thought process was, and I think I got a better understanding of what you were talking about relative to the content, the sugar content, and sucrose versus glucose versus plus fructose, that we shouldn't need markers. You know the chemical content of what's coming out of the crop, and the question we need to take up with Harry Baumas and the guy who raised that flag highest is, why doesn't that tell you everything you need to know? And if it doesn't, what do we need in terms of additional? Somebody's getting a music play. Is that you? Everybody's looking at their phones. So no, it's not me. It's somebody else. So we have a couple of missions that we want to take up next week. One of the other issues, and I think Dave's going to be at the meeting next week, along with David and yourself and myself, and we'll have our meeting with DOE. And the argument, and I finally got the spelling right, azeotropic, which is a purity question on ethanol. So what we want to do is convince them that they really do want to, as part of their working with Logitech, they want to expand the purity, I'll call it the purity level of the alcohol that they work with. Whereas they're currently working with a 99% purity level, the alcohols we get here are going to be less than that, or that we should make sure they're a little bit less than that, and then say this is not an issue of where what sugars came from. It's an issue of whether you can expand the purity spec. And by the way, we can get that alcohol to allow you to expand the purity spec. Why is that a problem? Or that can work, right? And if it doesn't work, then we got a policy argument. And that discussion, I think, is very frequently people will work process issues with something less than the absolute, the real feedstock they want, because quite frankly, they can't get it in quantities at the purity level that they want. So I think this creates an opportunity for us to set up a meeting with DOE staff now. If DOE staff says, gee, I don't know who my boss is, so I can't make any commitments, and I won't know for 6 months, which is probably what's going to happen, is then we've got the case for the transition teams to work on. And to the degree that Ed, you or Mike or somebody knows somebody who's going to be working transition, then that gives us a case. So I think we have not just this new task that was mentioned, that Dave's going to give us a little paragraph that we can, here's the key, here's the problem and the path to resolution, but we also have some tactics that we want to follow, and I think it was productive discussion in that sense. So thank you all. Thank you, Dave, for impromptu coming up here.
No problem.
I'll turn it over to Dave.
Thanks for having me. I'll leave the stage to you.
Yeah.
So great job, Rich. Great job. Thanks to your group for the hard work you put in on that. Our group talked about the production economics, and we had 3 key challenges. One was making sure that the new sugar feedstocks are produced will be price competitive at scale. The other was identifying current efforts to facilitate the project development plan and timeline. And the third was being able to ensure these crops, these biofuel crops, at levels equivalent to food crops. So with that, David, if you could kind of summarize the group's conclusions.
Sure. We made some process decisions, which was the main event. So we're targeting 500 acres. At 40 tons an acre, that's 20,000 tons of raw beets. And that would be processed somewhere between, at a rate of somewhere between 120, maybe 150 tons per hour, as that's what the equipment size is, harvesting equipment size is. Whether we can put together equipment that'll allow that to operate for a full 8 hours at a stretch, or we have to run for 4 hours and catch up, we'll find out. The process that we decided on, if you remember back to the slide that I showed you this morning, harvest the beet, there'll be a washing step, chopping, milling, and then into the hot tube reactor that Randy told you about with the residence time, and into a flash tank. After that, the decision has been made, we are going to separate the solids material. The undissolved material, the dissolved sugars, will remain in the aqueous stream, the liquid stream, the solids. will be pressed, hopefully to something less than 60% moisture, and those will go off for pelletizing to cattle feed. And this should give us a very dense, caloric, high-value pellet that can be stored and used all year round. Running the wet pulp right into silage is problematic. No one knows in this particular climate, Florida, South Florida is different than North Florida, if that is something that can be done, even though we know it is done today up in Michigan. But what works in Michigan won't work down necessarily in this agricultural climate zone. The energy requirements for specifically for the steam explosion, we're going to take a look at those. We don't want to get ourselves into something that's just so energetically expensive that it doesn't make sense and would fail an LCA test for RIN certification. We're going to make an estimate of the OPEX at 500,000, 500,000 gallons of diesel, 3 million gallons, 10 million gallons, and 50 to 100 million gallons. The output of the process, excuse me, I got ahead of myself. In addition to the solid material, the liquid material, which we'll call a sweet water, will have about 10+% sucrose dissolved in it. That is available for direct fermentation, which will be done off the farm, and distillation to give ethanol as a chemical starting material to a process to make dedicated to making jet fuel. Or it can be concentrated, falling film evaporator, to a syrup, not to a crystal, but to a 67% brick syrup, which is stable and can be stored and shipped conveniently and used as a feed solution for other fermentations, other fed batch fermentations, such as Amyris might run. So we've got to identify some pellet mills that can handle the material coming in and give us the exact specs. Will we have to dry it ourselves with waste heat off of the steam explosion equipment? And some equipment vendors or lessors that we can rent equipment from or have fabricated to put on a skid that we can take around and do this work.
So clearly, we have both a ramp from 500,000 to 3 million, 10 million, 50 million gallons as kind of a long-term ramp up, as well as an initial stage. Of course, if we were able to get the contracts between the processors, the growers, and the end users, we could, leap to any one of those stages that we can finance. But on the basic goal, initiating the project, we're hoping to at least do 500 acres. What I would like to do, thank you, David. You did a great job summarizing that. Spike, was there anything else that we missed? You got it? The other thing we'd like to do is, Christina, if you could come down here and just narrate. What we did is we have a little video we'd like to share. He talked to you about the steam explosion process. So to be absolutely clear what we're talking about, this is a project that has been run for the last 5 years at USDA ARS to do citrus pulp to ethanol. But I'll pass it to you, Christina.
Okay, so we actually just created a video, and it shows the steam explosion process on our pilot scale system. And this was actually a process that we completed, I think, about 2 weeks ago on sugar beets. And it has captions, so it's not really necessary for me to, I think, add to those captions. I'm gonna let you guys watch it. There's no sound, and you can just see here our technician, Pei Ling, is feeding the sugar beets into the hopper. And then there's a screw in there, and that screw is going to push that material through into the system. And there is a jet cooker that is actually adding steam to the material, and the material continues on into this holding tube that you see. There's 3 tubes there, and I'm standing sort of behind there. And that is where the material is being held for 1 to 3 minutes with the steam at 50 psi. And then I'm there, and I'm actually controlling the pressure with a back pressure valve, and I'm monitoring the pressure on a digital display. And you can see Randy and our technician, Sandra, and they're taking a look at the computer that is actually logging all of the data. And there's our flash tank, and that's where all the material is collecting. And then it goes from the flash tank through a tube using a pump to where it is collected. And you can see Sandra is here actually collecting the material, and you'll actually get to see what it looks like. It's like a brown applesauce sort of looking material. And it's very hot, that's why it's flowing so well here, but once it gets down to like room temperature, it becomes much thicker, obviously. And there you go.
Thank you, Christine. So that shows the highly labor-intensive and the willingness for Randy and his team and Sandra and Christine to do a lot of hard work. It's been a real labor of love. We really appreciate you stepping up. This was just spontaneous. We would need a product and a solution given Florida's temperature, climate, humidity to stabilize these beats as quickly as we can. So we have a 4 to 8 hour window. One thing we want to clarify, I had some questions that people asked me, how long is this crop? When do you plant it? The beets are planted in October, November, harvested in April, May. They need to be harvested before their feet get wet, before it gets too wet. Then we would have a crop and a half of sorghum basically, or a crop of corn in rotation. The beet has to be rotated every 3 years because of virus and fungus. That's the rotation. But I just wanted to make clear, several people said, how long can you grow beets? Well, it's basically October 1 to May in Florida. It can be extended, but you run the risk of flood. If it gets below, if the field gets flooded, it's not good for the beet. So with that, I want to thank.
Yeah,
can
I ask a question? On what the work that you did it, how much, there's always scale issues in all of these things. You want to know that the economics of the process are going to make sense. At least we know we can do it based on your experiment. But as you assess that, what scale, how much of that did you actually do?
That was 200 pounds of sugar beets.
Okay. Now, what kind of challenge do you run into when you increase that to get to what is it where our first lot wants to be about then?
Well, let's go back to David. How many tons an acre? I mean, an hour? How many tons an hour?
Well, what we heard is that current harvest equipment can put raw beet out of the ground at 120 to 150 tons an hour. Now, that's fine. If you only run the equipment for half a day and it takes you the rest of the day to catch up, or if you run the equipment for 8 hours and it takes you an additional 5 or 6 to catch up, that's going to be okay. But yeah, we're still talking about high throughput.
Yeah, if we can hear me. One obstacle that we encountered in resizing our beet tissue, we went to perhaps a much smaller size than is absolutely required. And as a result of that, our pumping slowed down, our feed pump. We had to feed it much more slowly than we would citrus peel, just to give the pump a chance to catch it and push it through the system. So there's still some need to appropriately combine your pump, what pump you're going to use related to how fast you need to pump this stuff.
Okay. You guys have, from a resource point of view, because we're looking at what the challenges are now and what we need to go and what our shopping list needs to be. So the question is, do you have the wherewithal with what you've been budgeted to scale this up to get the necessary throughput?
No.
Okay.
So where we are, Rich, if I may, our group made a determination of what needed to be done, and we basically delegated it to Dave to size the equipment, spec the equipment, estimate the energy use, and estimate the rental cost if we can use existing equipment. So that's our next step, to test that on a 500-acre model so that we can have an answer for both the feed company and the potential offtake agreement on the sugar, because there's a market for sugar. We're estimating 9 cents, the dirty market for sugar, 16 cents a pound internationally, but there's restrictions on exports, so we may not be shipping them out of the country. But there's all those issues, and we're going to address that in the next 60 days.
Well, in the next 60 days, and we need to write up a challenge on that issue.
Right.
Because that's not going to get him the money to run what he needs to run. So we need to identify that as a challenge so that we can be positioned to go work that problem. And
I
that
think
ought
we
to be
did. I
added
think
to the list.
I think that's what we
Yeah,
talked
and
about.
that, I just remind everybody, including the three of us up here, that, look, we're going at this as an economic development group, okay, a public group. If we were a startup company, we would be building a pilot plant not to make money, but to generate data that would allow us to design the plant that's going to make money, or to make the decision that that plant will not be built. All right, so we are building our pilot plant. We are doing this the output of the pilot plant is going to be good data, economic data, engineering data, and so on. But that's what we're doing here. We're not trying to make money next Monday morning.
Right.
The other thing, Rich, is that one of the things that we said as another step for us was David and I and a few other people were going to get on a call with the feed people and try and assess their requirements and also look at some of the existing plants. There's
The pellet.
yeah, the pellet requirements would be one step. The other piece was we would go to renewable spirits. They have a 500,000 gallon plant. Could we just use that plant? Could we repurpose an underutilized facility? Could we go to Tropicana? Could we go to Dreyfus facility? There's 4 or 5 potential operating plants at 500,000 gallons or more that we might repurpose. So that's part of our 60-day action steps.
Okay. And this gets more into the if you need public resources, we need to tee up what the issue is, kind of structure out what we need, whether it be in the ARS budget or whether it be something for a value-added grant proposal to your share. We need to be able to identify that, and hopefully that's the path you're on in 60 days here.
And that's the goal.
Tee that up, so that'll be.
We may be able to
nothing we
get
can
some of that.
discuss in great depth.
Hopefully David and I can put our heads together before next week and do
Yeah,
at least a
and-
first sketch so that when we get up to DC, we can there may be sources for support in that area.
Yeah, and that could either be, could be ARS, could be NIFA, potentially, I would think. Randy?
There was one proposal that's been submitted. I don't know when review panels are going to be meeting for that, what the results of that would be.
You mean our?
We already did. We've done 2 grant
Submitted, we did.
applications.
Okay.
We
that
did
one.
2. We did 2.
But that wasn't equipment money, it was not equipment money.
That was more for the crop itself.
Yeah, and process
Right.
development.
Yeah, so there may be, we'll have to see what that window looks like, but doing what's appropriate in that area may be the key ingredient here for the value-added approach next year. So we'll keep that. We got a bunch of tools in the toolkit. They aren't going away with the presidential election. We just need to be very focused on what we want and have the right kind of advocacy. We can get there, just like we got here with this
Right.
program.
Is there anything else in our group that we missed? One point that was raised was we need to have an energy budget to make sure it doesn't affect the RIN, and that's what David mentioned earlier, so that was a priority. So I think we covered it. So we have a good list of, maybe it's 9 or 10 challenges and
Yeah, we
pathways.
just got the 2 we got to add, the one Dave brought up and this one relative to the processing.
Or the use of alternative facilities, so.
Well, it is a problem, a challenge, the pelletizing, but thinking as one coming from upstate New York where there's failing pulp mills around and there's a huge interest in repurposing assets that are in the ground to save local jobs. So if there's a pellet mill that's underutilized or in danger of being shuttered, repurposing that pellet mill is, yeah, sure, it's a challenge. It's work that's got to be done. But there may be a tremendous upside to that, too, in keeping a local facility opening and using assets that are already sunk cost.
Are there any wood pellet mills in Florida?
Well, I don't think we need a wood pellet mill. I mean, I'm talking about citrus mill that's not got any more citrus.
Citrus mill.
Okay, so with that, questions?
No, we also had some discussion about the crop insurance and
Oh, yes.
working towards that.
Yep, that's on the list. Sorry, thank you very much.
Yes. So we would work with the Farm Service Agency here in the state of Florida. Brian and Amy and I are going to meet, get on a conference call, and
That's FSA.
FSA, USDA FSA,
Right, and
crop
that's-
insurance. It's called crop insurance or something like that.
Right. Who was the person that helped us out there on the staff there? Who was the person? Yeah, we had a person who was very helpful there. So I think FSA, we got a good.
So we need to follow. That's another challenge that we have in front of us.
Okay.
Thanks, Brian. Anything else? With that, I want to thank everybody. It's been a long, hard day. Give yourself another round of applause for hanging in there. And we'll be working these notes, getting these reports together. The FTP site will have all the materials that we have here. We'll also have a YouTube site for the presentations. And anything else that we missed, give me an email and drop me an email, and we'll be looking forward. Probably our next meeting will be late January, early February to wrap it up, and that'll be our final meeting on this stage of the study. Thank you.
All right. So we got out of there.